Hey, hi everybody, good to be with you today. Apologies for my over-emotional thing yesterday. I was going to redo it and I thought, well, what the heck. But today I want to continue. Yesterday we spoke about the whole standing in thing, how God prepares us, and then God shows us what the gap actually looks like, the one that He wants us to stand in. But before we can stand in the gap, we've got to see the gap. Now God saw it. He says in Exodus 3, I have seen the pain of my people. I have seen it. God has eyes, and He is an all-seeing God. He sees everything. There's nothing in your life that He does not see. That is the personal application. But with that application comes a personal implication that maybe you need to respond to. If God sees all of our needs, He sees it. He sees it. It's clear. He would suggest that once we know that He sees, we better open our eyes and we begin to see. We see the needs of those around us as He sees our needs. People who we have ordinarily never associated with, all of a sudden their particular needs and their particular dilemmas become a reality to us, and all of a sudden it's kind of like the blinkers are taken off our eyes and we begin to see God as God sees people. And when we see see people the way that God sees people, I'm going to tell people, that can trash your entire life. It can, and it has. When we begin to see the value of a human being, not because they're healthy, wealthy, or can give something to us, but when we see the value of a human being just because they are human beings, that can change your entire life. And when we begin to put God's value on people and not our value on people, because we've had a different value system to God. But God values people in the most incredible ways, and He wants us to see people through His eyes. And when we see people through the eyes of God, when we see people the way that God sees people, all of a sudden our attitude begins to change. You know, we in South Africa have grown up with an interesting, tragic past where we saw people in a particular way because that's how we were programmed to see people. But when God comes in and changes that, everything changes in our lives. We need to pray more for more of that kind of thing. And those of you who know me know that I have used a word very often called a scotoma. A scotoma is simply a blind spot. A scotoma is simply a thing where I see but I don't see. And I think in many nations of the world, ours primarily as well, very strongly so, we see situations but we don't see them anymore because we see them all the time. And every time we see somebody in need, every time we see a challenge, every time we see an injustice, every time we see a tragedy, we tend to just thicken the callus of the skin on our eyes. It's called a scotoma. And it develops a thickness that you can't see through it until one day God comes and removes that scotoma, that blind spot, that callus on your eyes, and all of a sudden you begin to see people the way that God sees people, and guys, the way that God sees you. And when we begin to see people like this, everything will change. All of a sudden our value system changes. All of a sudden our priority system changes. All of a sudden our material ambitions change. When we see the value of a human being and we see people through the eyes of God. Have a look at Peter in the Bible, in the book of Acts. He sees people from a good Jewish perspective. I'm a good Jewish man. And God had to peel away those scotomas from his eyes and show him the true value of a human being. Be him a Jew, be him a Gentile, be it a male, be him a female, it doesn't really matter. God needs to peel away those scotomas and those blind spots from our eyes. I think sometimes we in our particular country are guilty of seeing the same thing over and over, that our hearts and our eyes have become callous. We don't see their needs anymore. We don't see the pain that they suffer anymore. We just judge them unfairly very often, or at least judge them according to maybe half-truths or wrong perspectives, and we need to pray for a divine re-revelation of the value of a human being. Now, this theme has changed my and Helene's life over the course of these years as we begin to see people through the eyes of God. And when we see people through the eyes of God, it will raise up and make us take notice and actually, for goodness sake, do something. For goodness sake, it's pointless hearing and seeing these things unless we're going to do something about it. So if you want to stand in that gap for God, I'm going to tell you, it's going to involve you seeing people as God saw Egypt in their dilemma, their homelessness, their slavery, and God's going to instruct you to see the same thing of people as He saw of them, and I remind you again, as He sees of you. So what are you going to do? Carry on the way you always have? Well, that's kind of your choice, eh? You know, or you're going to ask God to say, Lord, remove these scotomas, remove these calluses that I have had on my eyes for so long, that have been programmed by personal experience, that have been programmed by hearsay, being programmed by negative talk. Lord, remove those things. And when you are courageous enough, because it's actually a courage issue, when you're courageous enough to be able to pray that prayer, watch what God begins to do. Gaps are going to be seen all around, and opportunities are going to rise up for you to respond to, as now God has prepared you, He's equipped you, and now He's shown you what the gap is. Just open your eyes, people, and begin to see people the way that God does. Let's go and have a good day. Let's go and save the world, people. Bye-bye.